I want you to think for a second about a very specific kind of person.
Well, I bet we all know at least one.
Right. I mean, this is someone who is just absolutely brilliant, like off the charts smart.
Yeah, maybe they're the lead engineer who can untangle, massive legacy code like it's nothing.
Exactly. Or the strategist who maps out market dynamics like 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room.
Right. Highly competent people.
Very competent. But the moment you put them in charge of a team or ask them to sit in on a delicate client negotiation, the whole thing just implodes.
It's a complete disaster.
Total disaster. They alienate their peers. They create this massive friction. And despite possessing this, generational intellect, they are a walking disaster when it comes to the human element.
It is a universally recognized archetype, honestly.
Yeah, why is it so common?
Well, the reason we see it so often is we operate on this deeply ingrained myth that raw computational intelligence is the ultimate skeleton key for everything.
Like if you're smart, you're good to go.
Right. We just assume a massive intellect automatically translates to effective leadership or interpersonal success. But decades of tracking high performers points in the exact opposite direction.
Okay, let's unpack this because we are looking at Daniel Goleman's research today for this deep dive, and his work just completely dismantles that myth.
It really does tear it down.
Yeah, we're pulling from a fascinating Big Think Plus session where he argues that mastering emotional intelligence is actually the ultimate uniquely human separator.
Which is such a massive paradigm shift.
It is, and we're going to look at the actual biological mechanisms today that allow us to rewire our brains for this.
But to even approach those mechanisms, we kind of first have to redefine the baseline of what we think of as smart.
Right, the whole IQ thing?
Exactly. We are raised in an educational infrastructure that practically worships the IQ score. The SATs, the ACTs, your GPA.
It's everywhere.
And Goleman doesn't dismiss IQ, to be clear. I mean, the research shows it's highly effective at predicting your school grades and, your starting salary.
So it's not useless?
No, it is the gatekeeper that determines what profession you can even enter. If you want to get into a top-tier law school or survive a surgical residency, you absolutely need that high cognitive baseline.
I look at it kind of like a cover charge at a really exclusive club.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, your IQ gets you past the bouncer, right? But paying the cover charge doesn't guarantee you're going to be the life of the party once you're inside.
No, definitely not.
It just means you are allowed to be in the building.
That is a perfect analogy because the math completely changes once you are actually inside the club.
Right.
This is a concept known in statistics as the restriction of range. Once you're in a high-level profession, you are no longer the smartest person in the room.
Because everyone else paid the same cover charge.
Exactly. You are in a room entirely composed of the smartest people. And at that point, the variance in IQ is so narrow that it becomes mathematically irrelevant for distinguishing the absolute best performers from the rest of the pack.
I have to challenge that a little bit, though.
Sure, go ahead.
If emotional intelligence is really the ultimate differentiator at the highest levels, why do the most valuable tech companies in the world still, exclusively filter candidates using abstract coding tests?
Oh, the algorithmic whiteboarding interviews.
Yeah. If the data proves emotional skills win the long game, why is the market still behaving like IQ is the only thing that actually matters?
Well, it really comes down to the mechanics of scale, honestly, and the cost of measurement.
Meaning it's just cheaper?
Exactly. You can design a standardized test with a clear right and wrong answer to assess mathematical reasoning for, million candidates simultaneously.
Which is super easy to automate.
Right. It's cheap. It's fast. Assessing how a candidate regulates their nervous system during a conflict, or how they empathize with a struggling peer, that is inherently messy.
You can't put that on a Scantron.
No, it requires deep human observation. So massive institutions just lean heavily into what they can algorithmically score right out of the gate.
But the long-term data tells a different story.
It does. When longitudinal studies track those exact same engineers a decade later, the data is undeniable. The ones who actually become outstanding leaders are almost entirely distinguished by their emotional intelligence.
And Goleman actually points out a fascinating kind of futuristic angle to this.
Oh, with AI.
Yeah, as artificial intelligence eats up more and more of those purely cognitive IQ-based tasks, writing the code, analyzing the spreadsheets, generating legal briefs.
All the heavy lifting, cognitively speaking.
Exactly. The premium on those raw computational skills is just going to plummet. Emotional intelligence is going to be the enduring, unautomatable human currency of the future.
Which is a great point, and it brings us to the history of the concept itself, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, take us back to 1995.
So back in 95, Goleman was actually a science journalist for the New York Times, and he was covering the brain and behavior.
Okay.
And he stumbled upon this highly obscure academic paper by two researchers, John Mayer and Peter Salovey.
And Salovey actually recently served as the president of Yale University, right?
Yes, he did. And their paper was simply titled Emotional Intelligence.
Which Goleman notes that initially the phrase sounded like an oxymoron to him.
Yeah, because we don't usually put those two words together.
Right. We are so culturally conditioned to view logic and emotion as these opposing forces at war in our brains.
Right.
Like you are either a cold, rational stoic, or you are an irrational emotional reactor.
There's no in-between in the popular imagination.
Exactly. But Goleman's work bridges that gap, arguing that true intelligence requires the integration of both.
And his initial goal, interestingly, was just to bring this integration to schools through social emotional learning programs.
For kids.
Yeah, for kids. But as he applied the research to high-performing adults, he developed this framework consisting of 4 distinct domains.
And what's critical here isn't just, memorizing the 4 pillars, but really understanding the biological sequence they follow.
Right. It's a very specific progression.
So let's walk through that sequence. Domain number 1 is self-awareness.
The foundation.
Yeah, this is basically knowing your feelings in real time and understanding how they are shaping your impulses.
What's fascinating here is how self-awareness acts as the structural keystone of the whole thing.
Like, without it, the whole thing falls apart.
Completely. Without it, the entire emotional architecture collapses. And this goes straight to the actual anatomy of the brain.
Walk us through the biology of that.
Okay, so when someone insults you, or say a client cancels a massive contract, your visual and auditory cortices route that threat directly to the amygdala.
Which is like the brain's primitive alarm system, right?
Exactly. And it gets that signal way before your logical prefrontal cortex even knows what's going on.
So that's the classic amygdala hijacks. Your body is just instantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline before you've even consciously processed the bad news.
Precisely. You're in fight or flight instantly. And self-awareness is that tiny millisecond gap where you recognize the hijack is actually happening.
Like saying to yourself, my heart is racing, I'm feeling incredibly defensive right now.
Exactly. If you lack that self-awareness, you physically cannot engage the prefrontal cortex for the second domain, which is self-management.
Because you can't regulate a stress response you don't even realize you're having. You can't put out a fire if you don't know the house is burning.
That is a perfect way to put it.
So self-management is what you actively do with that awareness. It's handling the anger or the anxiety. Goleman uses the example of road rage, right?
He does, yeah. It's the classic test of self-management.
Like, can you catch the amygdala hijack when someone violently cuts you off on the highway and then consciously choose to keep your focus on the present moment instead of retaliating?
Right, instead of laying on the horn or chasing them down. And once you master that internal environment, the framework finally moves to the external environment.
Okay, so moving from inward to outward.
Yes. The third domain is social awareness, which primarily functions as empathy. But we have to be highly, highly specific about what kind of empathy we're talking about here.
Why? What's the difference?
Well, there is cognitive empathy, which is simply understanding how another person thinks or feels on an intellectual level.
Just analyzing them?
Right. And sociopaths and manipulators actually possess exceptional cognitive empathy.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. It's exactly what allows them to exploit people so effectively. They know what you want to hear.
Okay, that is a chilling but vital distinction. So true social awareness requires emotional empathy.
Exactly.
That's not just a cold, calculated analysis of someone's psychological state. It means you actually care about their well-being. It's the literal foundation of trust.
And that leads directly to the fourth and final domain, which is relationship management.
The peak of the pyramid.
Right. This is the combination of the previous 3. Because you are self-aware and you're regulated and genuinely empathetic, you can finally handle conflict productively.
You can stay calm under pressure.
Yes, and build the kind of deep rapport that makes talented people actually want to follow you.
Okay, so if you're listening to these 4 pillars right now and you're realizing, wow, my self-management is a complete mess or my social awareness is really lacking, the immediate question has to be, are you stuck with that?
Like, is it permanent?
Yeah. Is your emotional baseline just locked in for life?
This is where the divergence from IQ is just so empowering.
Yeah.
Because IQ is remarkably rigid.
It doesn't really change much, does it?
No, it barely budges from adolescence to old age.
Yeah.
But emotional intelligence is highly learnable at literally any stage of life.
And it isn't just one monolithic score either. Like, you don't just get a 75 out of 100 in EQ.
Right, it's much more nuanced than that.
Goleman likens it to going to the doctor for a lipid panel.
I love this analogy.
Yeah, you get maybe 15 different data points back. You have your good cholesterol and your bad cholesterol across the whole emotional spectrum.
Exactly. You might have excellent social awareness, so high good cholesterol, but maybe you suffer from terrible self-management when someone criticizes your work.
So high bad cholesterol in that specific area.
Right. And upgrading those specific bad cholesterol areas relies entirely on neuroplasticity.
Which is the brain's biological ability to forge new neural pathways based on repeated intentional experience.
Yes, changing the actual wiring of your brain.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Goleman provides a very specific example of how this rewiring works in practice.
He identifies what he calls the common cold of emotional intelligence.
Right, which is poor listening.
Yeah.
Specifically, the habit of cutting people off.
Oh, we all know someone who does this.
We do, where you aren't actually listening to the person, you were just waiting for your turn to speak, or assuming you already know what they're going to say.
And fixing that common cold requires an immense amount of intentional metabolic effort.
It's not easy.
Not at all. Goleman suggests forcing a completely new behavioral sequence. You must consciously stop yourself from interrupting, let the person finish entirely, and then repeat back to them what you think they meant before offering your own opinion.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. To illustrate the initial discomfort of this, he points out how strange it feels to simply fold your arms with the opposite arm on top.
Oh yeah, that arm crossing trick is a classic seminar exercise, but I think we can even elevate that analogy to really capture the neuroscience happening here.
How do you mean?
Well, because folding your arms backward is just sort of awkward, right? But rewiring a behavioral trigger feels deeply physically exhausting.
It takes real energy.
Exactly. I like to think of your brain's neural pathways like hiking trails. Your bad habit, like interrupting people, is this beautifully paved 8-lane highway.
The signal just flies down it.
The electrical signal flies down that path effortlessly.
The path of least resistance.
Yes. But this new sequence, the listening, pausing, repeating back, that isn't a highway. That is a dense, overgrown, chaotic jungle.
No one has walked there in years.
Right. Forcing your brain to take that new route requires hacking through the brush with a machete. It feels exhausting, frustrating, and just deeply uncomfortable.
It's essentially behavioral physical therapy.
Yes. If you've walked with a limp for years to avoid knee pain, your whole body adapts to that dysfunction.
Right.
When a physical therapist forces you to walk correctly, engaging those atrophied muscles, it burns.
And that metabolic burn is the literal sensation of neuroplasticity at work.
It means it's working.
Exactly. It's Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together. The discomfort isn't a sign of failure. It is literally the friction of construction.
I love that phrase, the friction of construction.
And if you force yourself down that new, overgrown trail enough times, eventually the brush clears. The brain undergoes synaptic pruning, effectively dismantling the old highway.
So the bad habit literally degrades.
Yes. And eventually, the new, healthier habit becomes the default path of least resistance.
Okay, but this optimal state we're talking about, it isn't just a personal victory, is it?
What do you mean?
Like, if you go through the physical therapy and you fix your own emotional cholesterol, how does that impact the wider environment around you? Does neuroplasticity actually scale?
Oh, it scales with staggering speed, particularly in the context of leadership.
How so?
The research here is anchored by Sigal Barsad at the Yale School of Management. She studied a phenomenon known as affective spin, or more commonly, emotion contagion.
Contagion, like catching a cold.
Literally, yes. She proved that emotions function like an airborne virus.
Meaning they are biologically contagious. And the data shows they radiate outward strongest from whoever holds the most power in a given room.
Exactly. So if a leader walks into the office in a state of chronic anxiety or aggression, the team literally catches that neurological state. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly explains the evolutionary biology behind team dynamics.
Like going back to our caveman days.
Right. We have mirror neurons designed to simulate the emotional state of the alpha in our group. Because historically, if the leader of the pack was terrified, there was probably a predator nearby.
So you needed to be terrified too, just to survive.
Precisely. Fast forward to today, if the boss is stressed about quarterly earnings, the entire team's cortisol levels spike. They enter a state of chronic threat.
which is terrible for cognitive function.
It ruins it. Performance drops, creativity completely vanishes, and your most talented people quit just to escape the physiological toll it takes on their bodies.
I have to jump in here, though, to dissect a massive contradiction in our culture regarding this.
The myth of the tough boss.
Yes, because we relentlessly glorify the opposite of what you just said. Think about business lore or Hollywood movies.
Right, the screaming visionary.
We lionize the ruthless, demanding, highly stressful boss. You know, the Steve Jobs archetype who supposedly drives genius by terrorizing his engineers, or the screaming head chef in the kitchen throwing plates.
It's such a pervasive trope.
We are sold this myth that uncompromising ruthlessness is the actual engine of breakthrough innovation. But this Yale research suggests that archetype is actually sabotaging their own organization's survival.
It is an incredibly dangerous myth because it confuses cruelty with effectiveness.
Wow, say that again, confuses cruelty with effectiveness.
Exactly. The terrorizing genius archetype might achieve short-term breakthroughs, absolutely. But the data suggests they achieve them despite their low emotional intelligence, not because of it.
So it's not a sustainable strategy.
Not at all. A low EI leader can force a sprint to meet a deadline through fear, but they are applying a massive, invisible cognitive tax to their team.
They're burning the furniture to heat the house.
That's exactly it. In the long term, it creates an organizational disaster of burnout and high turnover. True, sustainable breakthroughs happen when a leader spreads positive contagion, bringing the team into what Goleman calls an optimal state.
Where people actually feel safe.
Right. In this state, the prefrontal cortex is fully online, psychological safety exists, and genuine innovation can actually occur without the cortisol crash.
So to truly understand the sheer power of this emotion contagion, we need to look at it functioning outside of like a sanitized corporate boardroom.
Somewhere much messier.
Yeah, if this is a biological reality, it should operate exactly the same way in the least hospitable environments imaginable. And the source material gives us a brilliant real-world example set on a New York City bus going up Madison Avenue in the middle of August.
Oh, this story is amazing. It is the perfect laboratory for emotional stress.
August in New York is brutal.
Right. Goleman recounts riding this bus on a sweltering, horribly humid, thoroughly miserable day. Everyone boarding the bus was trapped in this defensive, don't touch me, don't look at me bubble of urban survival.
It's a collective state of high, bad cholesterol.
Yes.
You hear the smell of the brakes, the awful heat, the sheer physical proximity to sweaty strangers.
A nightmare.
But the bus driver, a man named Govan Brown, deliberately hacked the emotional state of the entire vehicle.
She changed the whole environment.
As people boarded, he didn't just grunt and take their fare. He warmly engaged every single passenger. Like, welcome to the bus. How's your day going?
And it didn't even stop there.
Yeah.
As he drove up Madison Avenue, he acted as this localized, upbeat tour guide.
I'm putting things out the window.
Yeah. He called out department store sales to the commuters in suits. He announced museum exhibits as they passed. He maintained this continuous, joyful dialogue with a metal tube full of cynical strangers.
And the biological result of this was just magic. As people disembarked, their defensive bubbles had popped.
Because of the mirror neurons.
Exactly. Their moves had been completely transformed by his positive contagion. They went from hostile and closed off to visibly upbeat.
And the magnitude of this isn't just anecdotal, by the way.
No.
Years later, Govan Brown was actually featured in the New York Times. Passengers would literally stand on the sidewalk and let other buses pass them by just so they could ride with him.
That is incredible.
He generated 3,000 letters of praise to the transit authority and miraculously 0 complaints.
Which in New York City basically defies all known laws of physics.
It really does. But the profound reveal in the story is the mechanism behind why he acted this way in the first place.
Right, his motivation.
Govan Brown was actually a church pastor. He didn't view his passengers as mere transit cargo. He viewed them as his flock.
This raises an important question about how purpose intertwines with emotional intelligence.
I mean,
Well, the transit authority's goal was purely transactional, right? Move bodies from point A to point B on a rigid schedule.
very mechanical.
If Brown had adopted that mindset, he would have burned out from the stress of the traffic and the grumpy crowds. But by imbuing an incredibly mundane job with a higher purpose tending to a flock, he naturally amplified his own empathy and social awareness.
He reframed the whole experience.
He was operating at an elite emotional level, and that positive contagion rewrote the neurology of everyone who stepped onto his bus. It proves you don't need a CEO title or a corner office to be a leader who changes the biological reality of an environment.
It demonstrates that leadership is simply a matter of who is radiating the most dominant emotional state in a given space.
So what does this all mean?
Good question.
If we synthesize everything we've pulled from Goleman's insights today, the big takeaway is that emotional intelligence isn't some soft HR seminar buzzword.
It's hard science.
It is the complex 15-point lipid panel of our social health. Unlike the rigid ceiling of our IQ, we are not trapped by the emotional baseline we have today.
We have agency over it.
We can harness the biological reality of neuroplasticity. We can pick up the machete, hack through the dense brush, and do the exhausting behavioral physical therapy required to build entirely new neural pathways.
We can choose to change.
We can intentionally transform ourselves into better partners, better parents, and better leaders.
And honestly, we have a responsibility to do so because the science is absolute. Your emotional state is never contained entirely within yourself.
It leaks out.
Always. It bleeds into the nervous systems of everyone around you.
Which means I have a challenge for you, the listener, today. I want you to honestly assess your own emotional cholesterol.
Take a hard look at the panel.
Where are your data points a little out of whack? Maybe you are suffering from the common cold of interrupting your colleagues.
Or assuming you always know best.
Right. Maybe you are letting the stress of your workday hijack your amygdala and infect your family at the dinner table. Which specific behavioral trail needs a little uncomfortable, awkward physical therapy today so you can start rewiring that sequence?
And as you think about which habit to rewire, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought built on this research.
Lay it on us.
We've clearly established today that emotions are biologically contagious, radiating outward from whoever's leading the room, even if that room is just a city bus. But what happens when we apply the mechanics of emotion contagion to the digital spaces where we now spend the vast majority of our waking hours?
Oh, wow.
If effective spin is real, whose emotions are you inadvertently catching right now through your social media feeds?
That's a terrifying thought.
Who is the invisible digital leader shaping your optimal state or triggering your anxious state every single time you scroll?
It makes you wonder. If you're the brilliant genius from our opening who can't seem to manage the people around you, is it your raw intelligence holding you back, or are you simply oblivious to the kind of contagion you're spreading? Until next time, keep diving deep.